Look, if you're a Statham fan, you already know what his best movies are. They're the ones with plenty of action that allow Statham plenty of opportunities to perform insane stunts and an over-the-top story. It's why I've held movies like Transporter 2 and Mechanic Resurrection as the best Statham movies that I've discussed so far here on Statham Mayhem. However, there are two movies that stand tall above every other Statham movie. They're the craziest, most relentless, and most over-the-top action movies Statham has ever been in, and many hail them to be the very best of Statham's career.
I'm gonna kick some black ass.
What?
You look like you're on drugs or something.
The Crank movies. Crank follows Chev Chulios, who is injected with a poison that will kill him unless he keeps his heart beating through pure adrenaline. As you can imagine from that description, this movie gets balls to the wall crazy, as it uses its story to showcase insane stunts with a breakneck pace. The movie starts off going at 100 miles per hour and it never slows down. If anything, it just gets faster. Its frantic camera work and heavy metal soundtrack just add to the intensity of what's happening on screen. The entire movie feels like an R-rated violent cartoon as buildings bulge during bar fights, and every character has an exaggerated personality. It's basically a hybrid between an action movie and a dark comedy. This is a movie that is literally hyped up on Red Bull and cocaine, and I love it. If Mechanic Resurrection made me appreciate Statham movies, Crank made me fall in love with Statham's work as an actor and a stuntman. As I said before, this movie is just an excuse to make Statham pull off the most ridiculous stunts feasibly possible with their small budget. In order to keep himself alive, Statham drives a car through a mall, shocks himself with the defibrillator, something that will make a huge comeback in the sequel, has sex in public, stands on top of a moving motorcycle, and has a fist fight while hanging off the side of a flying helicopter. Even on rewatch, Statham's performance in this movie blows me away. Statham has never given a more intense, visceral performance than in the Crank movies. The tightly wound nature of Chev Chulios fits Statham like a glove. He's never given a second to rest in these movies. If he's not performing a crazy stunt, he's running, yelling, and doing exactly what you want to see from him. After watching Crank for the first time, he immediately went up the ranks in my mind to be right up there with Tom Cruise as one of the best working action stars and stuntmen. And it's because of that I started doing Statham Mayhem. It's because of that I think he should get more respect as an action star. Between all of the stunts in this movie and the ones he's done in all of his other films, he should be getting just as much praise and respect as Tom Cruise or Keanu Reeves. Tom Cruise got rightfully praise to high heaven for hanging off of a helicopter and hanging off the side of a building. So why isn't Statham getting the same amount of recognition when he does it? Especially when he did both of these stunts before Tom Cruise. And he did the hanging off of a building thing twice in both Mechanic movies. Oh, and he also jumped across buildings before as well. Statham is far too often forgotten when talking about action movie greats, and Crank is a testament as to why he shouldn't be. If all this movie had going for it was Statham's stunts, it would be impressive. But it's also a small budget action movie that was shot guerrilla style with a handheld digital camcorder. Directors Taylor and Neville Dean really made the most out of their budget. They used the small cameras that they had to make the visual presentation as energetic and unique as possible. Every scene in this movie is full of kinetic energy. Even when the limitations of their budget start to show, it actually adds to the feeling of authenticity rather than detracting from it. For example, when the camera zooms in from a sky view, you can see the Google Maps logo in the corner. Another example is when actress Amy Smart starts hiccuping in one shot because she genuinely had the hiccups on set. Or when they were filming this scene in the pool and the actors started to get water in their mouths as they tried to recite their lines and swim at the same time. These are the kind of small flaws that you just don't see in glossy Hollywood productions. But it's all incredibly charming because it's presented with such confidence and energy. This movie is a product of passion. It feels like just a few guys coming together to make something, and having a lot of fun doing it. This is a crew of people that had a very small budget and very little resources, but decided to throw caution to the wind and just make something absolutely crazy anyway. The feeling and style of this movie honestly feels like classic YouTube, which is fitting since they used YouTube at the time the movie was coming out to help promote the movie. This movie is really inspiring to me personally as someone who hopes to make his own action movie someday. These guys had a crazy idea, and they just did it. They filmed it using handheld cameras and rollerblades, but they did it. And it turned out good. That kind of fearless drive to accomplish your goals is inspiring to me. And I hope that one day when I make a movie, I can be just as determined and driven as these directors were. This is a movie that is so effective at hyping you up that it literally feels like taking a shot of adrenaline. Even after the credits start rolling, you'll feel like leaping to your feet and running a mile, because that's just the effect this movie has on you. The phrase non-stop thrill ride is a phrase that is thrown around a lot to promote movies, but it perfectly describes Crank from beginning to end. It truly does never stop delivering thrills, and with the small production this movie had, that is pretty amazing. Crank is the Statham movie that can be loved by both die-hard Statham fans and your average Joe who's just looking for a fun time. It has pretty much everything I look for in a Statham movie in spades, and rewatching it for this video made me realize that it easily beats Transporter 2 to become my #1 Jason Statham movie. After the success of Crank, Taylor and Neville Dean decided to make a sequel titled Crank: High Voltage. This one follows Statham's character after his heart is replaced with an artificial pump, and he must constantly electrocute himself to stay alive. It sounds even crazier than the first one, and it is. However, my feelings about this sequel are a lot more mixed than what I would like. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely reasons to love this sequel, and a lot of people do, as it gives you pretty much the same thing that you got in the first movie, only this time everything is even crazier. Statham shoves a shotgun up a guy's butthole, he uses booster cables to electrocute himself, he also electrocutes himself with a power plant before the movie stops to parody Godzilla, he has sex in public, again, this time in the middle of a stadium during a horse race. And he sets himself on fire by climbing onto and grabbing a transformer. The climax of this movie is an insane and unforgettable final battle that tops the climax of the first movie by quite a bit. There is no doubt that this movie is crazy, and if that's all you want from this Crank sequel, then you'll probably be really happy. The movie also explores the world of Crank, which is pretty clearly not like the real world at all. In the world of Crank, everyone is an exaggerated version of what they would be in real life. News anchors swear when they report the news, and everyone is either a horny pervert or a filthy low-life criminal, which leads to a pretty funny scene in a psychiatrist's office that parodies porn openings.
I'm gonna go out there and tackle the world.
No, don't tackle the world. Tackle a fucking whore. Get your dick wet.
This movie also contains some surprising cameos, especially if you're like me and you listen to rock and metal music. James Maynard Keenan from Tool and Danny Lohner from Nine Inch Nails make cameo appearances, and the late Chester Bennington from Linkin Park also makes an appearance. As great as all of this sounds, there are several things that really bring the sequel down for me. Some of them are complete negatives, while others somehow manage to both enhance and detract from my experience at the same time. My biggest problem with the movie is the editing. Every action scene looks like the person editing it had a severe case of schizophrenia. The camera is constantly cutting for no reason, and it makes the action hard to follow to the point of inducing a headache. It might be overlooked if it was just the action scenes that were edited this way, but even some of the non-action scenes are edited like this, and it's just annoying. I get that they were probably doing this to try to up the intensity, but it literally has the opposite effect. The editing in the first movie was not this distracting, and it never got in the way of the action. I don't know why they decided to change the editing style for this one, but it's a huge downgrade. My other negatives are a bit more complicated because they don't completely detract from the movie, but they're executed in a way that just feels wrong. My first sort of kind of but not really problem in the movie is the sexual content. Now just to clarify, I'm not a puritanical religious person, nor am I a sex-negative political advocate. I usually don't mind sex or nudity in a movie, and a lot of times I actually think it can be a plus if it's done right. But I'm not really sure the nudity and sex really enhances this movie at all. The directors were clearly influenced by pornography in this movie because all of the sex in this movie is gratuitous and exaggerated. There's that scene I mentioned earlier that parodies porn openings. Amy Smart also comes back in this movie as a stripper, and the directors even admit that they just did this so they could give her a nude scene. A comment that, while I appreciate for its honesty and transparency, it's also a comment that I feel definitely would not fly if made in today's political climate. There's even a scene in this movie that features a porn actor's strike, and they got real porn stars to be in the scene. Now, so far, what I've described just sounds like plain old fun. And to an extent it is, but it also feels disgusting in the way it's executed. There are certain shots and scenes that I can't show in this video without having my channel taken down, but for example, there's a scene where the doctor character is pinching and slapping a girl's butt in an extreme close-up, and it just makes me feel really gross. Although I don't generally agree with people who say that most nudity in movies is exploitive in nature, scenes like this genuinely do feel that way. The public sex scene in this movie also feels really shoehorned in, and as a result it feels pointlessly gratuitous. It feels like they just put it in there to call back to something that was already done in the first movie. It's like, hey, do you remember this? We did this in the first movie, but we're doing it again in this movie. Ha ha ha, isn't it so funny? We're doing it again, but this time it's even crazier. I'm not sure what I can say about the sexual content in this movie that will adequately describe the problem that I have with it, other than the way it's executed just feels disgusting. Some of it I can take as lighthearted fun, but everything else just feels... ugh. This leads me to my second kind of sort of negative with this movie, which is its dark humor. Crank 2 tries to take the dark humor of the first movie and make it even more offensive, and it doesn't work the way they probably intended it to. Now, I love me some dark humor. I think as long as it's done in good taste, even race or gender themed dark humor can be funny. However, unfortunately, I would not be able to describe the dark humor in this movie as being in good taste. There's a lot of racist humor in this movie. On top of that, there are also characters that just act like annoying racial stereotypes.
Hey! Hey! You didn't ask name. My name's Rhea.
All of this makes the movie feel incredibly juvenile, especially when you pair it with the sexual content that I was talking about earlier. I get that the whole movie is exaggerated. Everyone in this movie is racist to each other regardless of race, and everyone, regardless of race, is an exaggerated stereotype. But I can't help but feel that a lot of the racial humor in this movie just kind of feels genuinely racist. Now, I'm not saying that anyone involved in the making of this movie is definitively racist, but the humor definitely makes me uncomfortable in that way. Again, this is similar to the sexual content in that I can see why they wanted it in the movie. It fits the exaggerated tone and it could have worked to make the movie even more hilariously ridiculous. But the way it's executed just feels repulsive. If someone outright hated this movie for its depiction of minorities or its sexual content, I honestly couldn't blame them. However, on the flip side, I could see how both of these things wouldn't bother somebody. They could just see it as being part of an overall intentionally crazy and intentionally offensive movie full of exaggerated stereotypes and gratuitous content. However, for me in this case, I fall more on the negative side. And unlike the humor and the sexual content, I can't see very many strong defenses for the editing in this movie. Overall, I do have a fun time when I watch Crank 2. It's not at the same level as the first Crank, but Crank High Voltage is still one of the better Statham movies if you're judging it based on what you would want to see out of a Statham movie. Love 'em or hate 'em, the Crank movies stand out in the action genre as unique in nearly every fashion. There's a reason these movies have a large cult following among and outside of people who are Jason Statham fans. And it's because they're just that wild and intense. They are one-of-a-kind movies, and if you haven't checked them out already, you're really doing yourself a disservice. They're both a testament to the passion of young filmmakers and a showcase of Statham's underrated action movie performances. And once you're done watching them, you'll probably be cranked.